January 29th, 1969. This was a big day in Steelers history. It was the first ever draft class for general manager Dan Rooney and head coach Chuck Noll, and it was the foundation for the dynasty that followed in the 1970s. With their first round pick the day before, they chose Hall of Fame defensive tackle Joe Green, regarded by many as the greatest defensive tackle of all time. In the third round, they chose offensive tackle John Cobb, who would start 138 games at left tackle for Pittsburgh and would start all 4 Super Bowls for the team during the 1970s. And in the 10th round, they chose defensive end L.C. Greenwood, who made 6 Pro Bowls during the 1970s and has a legitimate claim for being in the Hall of Fame. That day, the Steelers pulled off a huge victory by completing this really good draft class. And that night, the Steelers got another huge victory as they defeated their arch rivals, the Cleveland Browns, in a game of basketball. No, I am not making that up. This is the story of the time that the Steelers and Browns, for some reason, played each other in a game of basketball. Now, before talking about this game, I should note that this is not my first video talking about the NFL and its relationship with basketball. At Super Bowl 21, the original plan was to have one shining moment play after the game. If you want to check that out and see how college basketball's anthem nearly became the NFL's anthem, it's in the upper right corner. I should also note that this was not the only time that the Steelers played a basketball game. In early 1978, the Steelers played a charity game of basketball against former players from Evansville in remembrance of the tragedy that occurred on December 13, 1977, when 29 people, including the entire Evansville basketball team and its coaching staff, were killed in a plane crash. However, the purpose behind that basketball game made sense. It was a way to get involved in the community following one of the most horrific incidents in the history of college basketball. It was a game for charity. And for years, players on the Steelers have played basketball games against the top high school players in the county in order to raise money for charity. But this game in 1969, this wasn't for charity. There is little known about this game, despite the fact that it's absolutely fascinating. I have no idea what the purpose behind this game was, or why it was played to begin with. News sources and newspaper articles are very limited about this. The move to play this game was announced in a newspaper on January 13th. That is absolutely fantastic timing for a football team to announce something like this, because it's not like anything big or important happened the night before that was going to dominate the news. Because of this, in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, which is obviously based in the city where the Steelers play, this got buried. It got a few sentences right next to articles about how the head coach of St. Francis was going to speak at a luncheon, and how a radio station was looking to organize basketball games. This did not get a lot of traction. Now, the Steelers and Browns do not like each other. They didn't back then, and even today, they don't like each other. On the gridiron, the teams had met twice a year each year since 1950, when the Browns left the AAFC to join the NFL. Cleveland had a sizable advantage in this series. In the 19 years of this rivalry at the time, the Steelers had swept the season series just once. That's it. And that came in 1959. Cleveland held a 29-9 advantage and had swept the season series in 1967 and 1968. The last time these teams met on November 17, 1968, the Browns won 45-24, and they intercepted Pittsburgh 6 times. So why would these two rivals play a basketball game against each other? Why would the Browns travel over 80 miles to play a basketball game against the Steelers? Again, I don't know. Information is so limited about this that even though I tried digging, I could find absolutely nothing on who was on the Browns roster for this game. But from what I can assume, both teams had basketball teams in the offseason to stay fit. At the bottom of the article, It turns out that if you called or wrote Bernard Reagan, you could actually organize a game with the Steelers. Theoretically, if I'm reading this right, you could get your buddies together at the Y or something like that and just set up a game with a pro football team. Man, were times different half a century ago. As I said earlier, there's no info on who was on the Browns roster. But we do know who played for the Steelers. Wide receiver Roy Jefferson, standing at 6'2", was the biggest star on the team. He was coming off of an incredible 1968 campaign where he made the Pro Bowl. He led the league with 1,074 receiving yards, and he finished second in the league with 11 receiving touchdowns. Halfback Dick Hoke, standing at 5'11", was coming off of a Pro Bowl campaign in 1968 where he finished fourth in the league in rushing yards. Those were the only two Pro Bowlers that Pittsburgh had on offense, and they both played in this game. In 1968, they also had two Pro Bowlers on the defensive front, and both of those guys played in this game as well. Linebacker Andy Russell, standing at 6'2", made the first of what would be 7 Pro Bowls that year, and defensive end Ben McGee, at 6'3", made his second career Pro Bowl during that 1968 season. Other players in this game included 6'3" center Ray Mansfield, who was coming off of his 6th season and would wind up playing in Pittsburgh until 1976. You had 6'4" defensive end Lloyd Voss, who was coming off of his 5th season in the league. You had 6'1" defensive back Marv Woodson, who made it to the Pro Bowl the year before in 1967. You had 6'5" tight end John Hilden, who scored 10 touchdowns in his 5-year career with the Steelers. And you had 6'3" tight end Tony Jeter, who had 3 career catches and never played football again after 1968. That's a neat trivia fact. Tony Jeter's final game ever with the Steelers was against the Browns in a game of basketball. So that's the background behind this game. But how did it turn out? The game took place at Thiel College, at what is now known as Beagley Gymnasium. The arena was relatively new at the time, having been built in 1966, and it held 500 spectators. Despite the low capacity, this basketball game between the Steelers and the Browns did not sell out. It was a near capacity crowd, but it was not a sellout. This game was not televised, so the only people who got to witness this were the less than 500 people in the gymnasium at the time. There were no sporting events that were even on television in Pittsburgh that night. If you turned on the TV on January 29, 1969, you could watch the very first episode of the Glenn Campbell Good Time Hour, which wound up being fairly popular, lasting 4 seasons and 91 episodes. You could watch a TV airing of the movie Adam's Rib, which is regarded as one of the best early romantic comedy movies ever. Or you could watch a TV airing of The Brass Bottle, which is a movie about a man who sets a genie free, but the genie has trouble adapting to the real world, leading to a whole bunch of shenanigans and misadventures. TV was way different half a century ago. But if you wanted to watch the Steelers and the Browns play basketball against each other, you actually had to be there. So the final result of this game? Pittsburgh ended up winning by a final score of 64-56. Again, there was little coverage on this game. It got a 5-sentence article the next day and was the last article placed in the sports section. There was not even a box score from this game. The only statistic that we know is that Roy Jefferson was the leading scorer for the Steelers on this day, as he had 12 of Pittsburgh's 64 points. Nothing like this is ever going to happen again, where two heated rivals go at it in a completely different sport. The risk of injury is too high, and a lot of contracts now have explicit provisions forbidding players to engage in activities like this during the offseason. And if for some reason a basketball game between the Steelers and the Browns was to be held in 2020, it wouldn't get a few sentences or no coverage whatsoever. It would be fairly hyped up, especially if it was being held on a day where not a lot was happening in the sports world. So if you were ever super bored in the offseason, and you ever wondered what would happen if the Steelers and the Browns played a game of basketball against each other, at least when it comes to 1969, you have your answer.